Ladies and gentlemen, we are now actually almost continuing where we left off. We're here in a panel discussion which is called Energy and Climate Scenarios, the Business Implications. And it's a great pleasure to moderate this session here with such a distinguished panel. Let me just tell you what this session is all about. I've just explained to you that we're living in a time of great uncertainty where there is extraordinary change in the energy industry and environment. We see several transitions happening and revolutions happening. One called, for example, the shale gas revolution in North America. Who in this room would have thought 10 years or 5 years ago that the United States would go from an importer potentially to an exporter of fossil fuels? On top of that, we have shifting geopolitics. We got climate change issues. We got water footprint coming on stage more urgently than ever before. We have just introduced to you our own World Energy Council scenarios, and I've talked in there about what we see as an impact on the climate change issue and carbon pricing. Now, all of this will shape the energy system in a very big way. Here in Asia, to stay locally, coal is a very big issue, and the question, is CCS a solution to the Asian coal, needs to come up. So we will, in this panel, deal with a couple of questions. How will all these uncertainties affect the future energy system, and what will be the critical drivers to watch? So what of all these wash list of drivers will be the ones which we think are the ones determining the shape of the future? Is the 2 degrees C target still achievable, or is it far from reality? What is needed to prepare for a plan B in case we do need to start talking about adaptation? Do we have any plans for a 4-degree or 5-degree world out there? Have governments and decision makers thought about that? And what are the implications for business? Let me introduce the panel which will address these questions. We have Brian Dames, and I start from this side here. First of all, we have Brian Dames, who is the CEO of Eskom Holdings in South Africa. Then we have Chet Davies, who is the CEO of Foreseen in Switzerland. Then we have Mr. Ho-Sung Lee, the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Then we have Ivo de Boer, who is a Special Global Advisor on Climate Change and Sustainability of KPMG in the UK. And we have Philippe Cochet, who is the Executive Vice President and President Alstom Thermal Power in France. Now let me give you a little bit of a background on each and any one of these distinguished guests. Brian Dames started his career with Eskom in 1987, and he actually held a variety of positions, including that, which I find very interesting, of a nuclear reactor physicist. As an engineer myself, that has some attraction, I must agree. He was then going on in his career to become engineering manager, power station manager, and eventually became the general manager of the nuclear division. In 2004, Mr. Dames was appointed managing director of the enterprises division, responsible for Eskom's capacity expansion program, and in 2008, he became chief officer of Eskom's generation business, encompassing Eskom's generation, nuclear, primary energy, generation engineering, and enterprises division. He was then further appointed chief executive and member of the Eskom Board of Directors on 1st of July 2010. Welcome. Chet Davies is somebody I know already since a very long time, actually. We spent some time together at Shell. Chet is now leading Foreseen, a company which is located in Switzerland. He has a background in scenario planning, which he started as a practitioner in Shell. He has over 40 years of experience in global business, energy, and sustainability, dealings with all regions of the world, managing large teams, and coordinating worldwide networks. He's particularly knowledgeable on energy matters and has been a pioneer in applying sustainability concepts to the energy business. He's the president and CEO of Foreseen, and he's co-president of the Global Energy Assessment Council, which governs a network of some 300 energy researchers and 200 reviewers. He was a managing director of the World Economic Forum from 2003 to 2007, and conceived, developed, and successfully implemented a world-class strategic insights program to underpin the forum's partnership activities. Before that, he was vice president of global business environment at Shell International from 1999 to 2003, and head of Shell's scenario planning team. And I'm proud to say that a lot of the things I know about scenarios, I actually learned from him. Welcome, Chad. Our third panelist, Mr. Ho-Sung Lee. He is the vice president at the IPCC. Ho-Sung Lee is a professor at the Korea University Graduate School of Energy and Environment from Seoul here in Korea. He's a member of the board of directors of the Korean Academy of Environmental Sciences, a senior advisor to the Korean Society for Climate Change Research and the Korea Resources Economics Association. And he's also a member of the Asian Development Bank President's Advisory Board on Climate Change and Sustainable Development. Mr. Lee was the founding president of the Korea Energy Economics Institute and Distinguished Research Fellow at the Korea Environment Institute. He's a faculty member and the Dean of the College of Environment at Keimyung University in Korea, and a senior advisor to the Minister of Energy and Resources and the Minister of Environment. He also served as the president of the International Association for Energy Economics and the Korea Resources Economics Association, and as a member of the International Advisory Board of the Patel Pacific Northwest National Lab. So we have here a very distinguished scientist. Welcome, Mr. Professor Lee. Then Ivo de Boer. Ivo de Boer joined KPMG in July 2010 as the Special Global Advisor Climate Change and Sustainability. He's responsible for thought leadership and strategy development and acts as a global ambassador for KPMG worldwide. Prior to joining KPMG, Mr. de Boer was the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the body responsible for a multilateral response to the climate change challenge. Before this, he was the Director of International Affairs of the Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning and Environment of the Netherlands, Deputy Director General for Environmental Protection in the same ministry, and he used to work for the United Nations Center for Human Settlements. Mr. de Boer has been involved in climate change policies since 1994 and seeks broad stakeholder involvement in all issues relating to the challenge. He is a member of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, co-chair of the Task Force on Climate and Energy, a member of the CMCI steering group, as well as a board member of the Carbon Markets International Association. He also received a knighthood from Her Majesty the Queen of the Netherlands in 2009. And last but not least, let me introduce Philippe Cochet, the Executive Vice President and President Alstom Thermal Power. He started his career in 1986 in the field of advanced production techniques in the automotive industry. From 1988 to 1994, he held various positions at Thomson Multimedia. He then joined General Electric as a vice president in 1994 and in 1998 he was appointed Vice President GEMS for Eastern Europe, based in Budapest. In 1999 he was then appointed Vice President of Executive Committee of GEMS for the X-ray activity at worldwide level. In 2003 he joined Hager as an Executive Vice President of Operation, and in April 2006 he was appointed President of Alstom Hydro Holding and Senior Vice President of Alstom Hydro and Wind. Between 2008 and 2011, he was Senior Vice President, no, he was Chairman of HEA, the Hydro Equipment Association, and was also a member of the board of the International Hydropower Association. Philippe Cochet was appointed President of Alstom Thermal Power and Executive Vice President of Alstom on 4th of July 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you will agree, we've got here a panel which is more suited than any other to talk about the topic which we just outlined. So let me start with you, Mr. Dames. When you think about uncertainties, critical uncertainties going into the future, which ones are the critical ones in your view for businesses?
Thank you, Carl. Before I kick off and answer your question, let me just put a punt in for some work that Dr. Jim Keller in Frontier and I are doing around sustainable energy for all for the UN Secretary General. And that leads me to the question that we're all trying to solve, and I think it's quite important to understand that. I think we're trying to solve finding a sustainable energy solutions for everybody on this globe within the physical limits of this planet. And I think that is the work that we're trying to do in doubling certainly the penetration of renewables, making sure that we get to universal access and seeing a significant drive of energy efficiency. And so it's very true that the era that we live in, an era of great uncertainty within the electricity sector, I think the first issue for me is the issue around social changes. I think more of what's going to happen to the energy industry is going to be driven by people outside of this room and really by changes within society, really where customers will become more pro-consumers. In other words, they're going to influence themselves what they will generate, their own needs, and that will be fueled increasingly by the access to information. The second part of this major social change relates to more and more people being connected to the grid and people changing their economic futures. Energy access is not just about giving people facilities to cook and facilities to have lighting. It is about them changing fundamentally their economic futures, and that will impact load profiles and will significantly impact network designs of electricity systems throughout the world. We are also seeing, obviously, major technological changes responding to the impacts of climate change and also the impacts of pricing. And hence the emergence of low-carbon technologies such as PV, and we had a long discussion today about that, and also, obviously, the issues of storage technologies, and that's going to be a key issue for us and a key driver for us to look out for. Within Southern Africa, and certainly within the African continent, we've been talking through what are the real important parts. It is for us about energy security, firstly. It is for us about energy access, affordability, and lastly, how do we make sure that we do that in a sustainable way? And therefore, it's very difficult to make sure you find a balance between these aspects, given the resource constraints. As far as some of the biggest threats that we face, particularly on the African continent, regarding climate change is the issue of water availability. And really, Africa getting itself ready to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And hence, the work we're doing as a company, developing some of the largest dry cooling technologies available to deal with that, including research and development around dry desulfurization technologies, and the reuse of water becomes crucially important in our environment. The implications on the business obviously with all of this uncertainty, we have to carefully look at our long-term planning. And as a business, we're building significant flexibilities that would allow us to then change given our long-term aspects of our business. So we have to monitor very carefully technology changes in society, and changes as far as access to electricity is concerned that is growing. And for that perspective, similar to the work that you've presented to us, have developed plausible scenarios for the next 40, 50 years. And for us, that's about the best way in order to ensure that our strategies are robust given changes in direction.
Okay. So you stress very much here the flexibility of the portfolio because of the uncertainties. Chad, as a long-term expert in dealing with issues around how to generate robust strategies, what is your take on the critical uncertainties going forward?
Let me start exactly at the other end, because for me, and by that I mean, let me start at the other end, which is really the short term, because it's quite critical to understand the context within which decisions are going to be made. For me, the starting point has to be the developments that we see in climate science. That's really absolutely critical, but that's only the starting point. I think the second is the effectiveness with which we communicate those results and their consequences, potential consequences to the public. And I think by and large, we haven't done a very good job at that. I think thirdly, this is intimately tied up with that, is how public opinion changes. And we've seen how in difficult economic times, public opinion can lower the ranking of the climate change issue. So these are really important things both to monitor and understand. To the extent you build scenarios over time, you really have to think hard about the public support for action. But that's just the starting point. I think we next get to actions. Firstly, the degree of success in implementing carbon markets. I think the disappointments in Europe have not helped the case for developing comparable activities elsewhere. That isn't to say there aren't, but it's patchy, and I'm sure others will comment on that. I think also we need to monitor very carefully the degree of diffusion of carbon abatement policies around the world. And I think it's a topic that's come up in the scenarios. It's the issue of CCS. One of the measures as to whether we are or are not taking seriously climate change is the extent to which we're prepared to put at risk significant money, either individually within countries, and more likely across countries, in order to ensure we have some of the tools that are needed. We then get closer to the real issue that's discussed. I think it's to do with the current pledges. What we know from current analysis, and I'm talking of analysis of a few months now, which is doing the rounds, as it were, we know that if the current pledges are embedded in pathways to 2030, we have some really big problems in having any chance of getting to 2 degrees centigrade. We would need CCS as a working tool in the period 2030 up to 2050, and we would need to bring back nuclear, and we would need massive emphasis on improvements in energy efficiency. Most people, I think, looking at what would need to be done if the pledge pathway is the pathway to 2030, is that we're just not going to make it. And to some extent, the work of the World Energy Council endorses that. If I assume your own work is looking at possibilities through the realistic but stretch target eyes of business and government, I think certainly in Symphony you're looking perhaps as far as you can go. And that, without having looked at the detail, I think would require you to move beyond current pledges before 2030. So movement there is absolutely critical. I would make just one other point, because we may come back to this, and this is the absolutely critical need to understand adaptation, and I will comment on that in a moment if we get into that topic. But I'm reminded when I look at the adaptation, the potential to do adaptation scenarios, of the sort of situation we were in Royal Dutch Shell in 1989-90 when we first started to do climate change work and develop sustainable world scenario. We frankly are extremely ill-equipped to do adaptation work, if for no other reason, it in a genuine way addresses the nexus issues of climate, energy, water, and others might throw in food. And let's be very clear, the targets that we have for universal access for 2030 are going to be made much more difficult if we are focused in a rather crisis and dramatic way in resolving the consequences of not reaching climate change targets that governments, scientists believe are necessary to reduce planetary environmental risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Not a happy picture. Professor, the professional view from the IPCC, what critical uncertainties are you seeing and what should we watch in particular?
I want to start by indicating that uncertainty is not new. We live with uncertainty in every second. And in fact, all of you fellows make decisions on the basis of uncertainty. And therefore, what is important is, in my view, is to how we best manage this uncertainty and this risk. And I firmly believe that you are the expert in risk management in your own field. Therefore, I do not want to go into detail of those matters. But I want to highlight one aspect of this uncertainty, that is the low probability and high consequence event. And the major problem with this event is that we do not really a good metric to manage, to handle this low probability, high consequence effect. And the researches and literatures have generally shown that these events, these so-called catastrophic events, preceded by some signs, warning signs, that for some reason are not recognized. And therefore, in that sense, by developing or by recognizing these early warning signs, I believe that science has a very vital role to play. And it is up to the policy makers, decision makers, to use the reports of the science to connect the dots in properly interpreting and also preparing for themselves this low probability, high consequence effect. And every year, there is World Economic Forum, already mentioned early this morning's session, and also several speakers mentioned that too. One of the publications I am really interested in is their report on global risk assessment, global risk report. And they asked the 1,500 experts around the world to pick 50 events what they think the most risky events that they expect to occur within the next 10 years. And then not only they ask the list of those events, but they ask the respondent to rate the probability of each event and also the consequence of those impacts. And they put up a very interesting charts every year. And on the vertical axis, you have the probability, and on the x-axis, you have the consequences. Obviously, you are going to look at the high consequence and high probability and high consequence effect. And very interestingly, according to the survey, the 4 out of 5, the most risky events the experts expect to happen in the next 10 years are related to climate change. And 2 are directly the events from climate change, and the 2 are indirectly related to climate change. Those two are the water stress, and the other one is agricultural problems. As you all know, the water is a direct medium that climate change impacts will be conducted through. And then the final impact will be on the agricultural products. Therefore, I think the experts believe, risk analysis experts believe, the climate change has high probability and high consequence effect. And, but actions really need to follow from this expert judgment. Third element I want to emphasize is a price of carbon. And theoretically, it's not that difficult to define what level of price of carbon society wants to change. But basically, we don't know really the right price of carbon. The challenge is to set the price of the product that we do not really know the right price. Obviously, the reason that we do not know the right price is due to this huge range of the estimate of social cost of carbon. And researchers are trying to narrow that range of social cost of carbon, and we will probably have to wait some more studies regarding this proper level of CO2 prices. So when we emphasize or mentions the price of carbon, we really need to ask on what ground and why a certain level of carbon prices are indicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All speakers, please. We need to really get close to these microphones, most probably because they come from the side. Otherwise, I'm afraid we might not be heard. Mr. De Boer, you have been in government. You're a thought leader. Your thoughts on critical uncertainties going forward and what needs to happen?
Well, thank you, Carl. I don't know if I'm the first person to do it, but I certainly want to compliment you and the World Energy Council on the fantastic scenario work that you've done as an input to this conference. I think that's a very important contribution. Your scenarios are very solid, very scientific. I want to add to that some, what I would call not a scenario, but some political guesswork. It's already been pointed out that ever since the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, the issue of climate change has been completely off the political agenda. And the question that I would like to address is what is likely to bring it back onto the political agenda and what could make that process a success. Now, in 2015, there's going to be the next big climate change conference, which is supposed to lead to a result that will commit all nations to action on climate change. That's a decision that was taken, and Brian will remember this, in Durban a couple of years ago. Now, France has decided to host that conference. And generally, when you host a conference, you like it to be successful. So what is France going to do in the run-up to 2015 to try and get the issue of climate change back onto the political agenda? My sense is that, and based on past experiences, that France can only be successful in that effort if France basically begins with the preparations for that now, if it begins to show real leadership now, and if it begins to engage a core group of critical countries now towards defining what could be a political success in 2015. And I would very much encourage concentrating such a political process with a group of core countries on a limited set of issues. I would concentrate it on a limited set of issues that first get the international political process moving again. Secondly, define commitments that are consistent with what is currently economically realistic. But then, thirdly, create a pathway to enhance action over time. And fourthly, to agree financing for the engagement of developing countries, especially on the issue of adaptation, which has also been raised. Another challenge is how do politicians bridge the gap between short-term pain for long-term gain? And there I think the issue of formulating a long-term goal is very important, in that while it does not lead to immediate cost, it does give the private sector some very essential long-term predictability in terms of where the politics of the process are likely to go. And remember, and we've seen this on the feed-in tariffs in many countries, although politicians cannot bind you beyond an election at the national level, international treaties can help to provide long-term predictability. Finally, to also align myself with something which has already been said, in 2015, I think it'll be very important to find the justification for action on climate change, not just on the issue of climate change, but on that broader nexus around climate, energy, food, and water, against the backdrop of population growth, urbanization, and wealth increase. Because I believe, at least, that the justification for action on climate change needs to be found within that broader context in order for it to be understandable for different communities around the world. In that context, I think it'll also be very important to give, especially the larger countries, the feeling that there is a comparability of action. And in that sense, I think the conversation that is happening at the moment between Secretary of State John Kerry and officials in China, in India, and Brazil is very important to ensure that key countries embark on that process with a sense that they are all pulling their weight. And my final suggestion would be to stay away from that poisonous and contentious issues of so-called international legally binding targets, if only because they are impossible to implement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Strong statement, that one. Now, last but not least, another view from the business. Philip, what have you got to say as a businessman?
Thank you, Carl. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to participate to this panel. When I look at the scenarios and when I look at 2050, the first things I think of is that I still have 148 quarterly financial results to announce. And the reason why I'm saying that, it's not simply to make a good joke, is also to say that so most of the actions that we can see are driven very often by short-term decisions, both on the business level, but also at the political levels. And I think that we need to think a little bit beyond that. So there are three things that I would like to highlight. The first one is the energy and technology mix. The second one is about the technology evolution, which is very dear to my heart. And finally, a long-term stable policies for energy. Listening to everybody, I think that we all come back to the fact that there is a need for a broad portfolio of energy. So we cannot discard any of those: nuclear, coal, gas, solar, wind, geothermal, even tidal in the future. So all are needed to get to where we want to go. The point is that none of the countries are equal in front of the energy security, and they really need to pick and choose the one that they need. This triggers the second thing. It's all about technology. Let's face it, today, out of the 5,560 gigawatt installed, 70% of that is coming from fossil fuel. And we will have to address that. It's something that we need to do from a technology standpoint. So not only we will have to work in the future on the technology for the new installations, but also for the install base. I just would like to give you one point. So if you look at an ultra supercritical boiler today, which has a 46% efficiency, if you would have, in the last 50 years, always installed the cutting edge technology on boilers, we would have saved 60 gigaton of carbon. This is 2 years of carbon emissions. And this was done by a report of the IEA, and I think it's really striking that what we can do with technology. On all technology, gas, we are now beyond the 60% efficiency. If you look at wind, so you have now offshore wind turbines at 6 megawatts, which are with fantastic capacity factors. So I really believe that technology can help, And it is the same for CCS and for carbon capture usage and sequestration. Technology will improve. We have already some demonstrations. We have already some plants that are running with this principle. So let's continue to do it because we all know that it's a big part of the future. But again, so we need to work on the cost. And this leads me to the third part, which is the stable policy. First of all, I think it's important to always know that the utilities makes an investment, or the IPPs makes an investment for more than 20 years. The cycle is very long. So they really need to know what is going to happen from a policy standpoint. What has happened recently in Europe for the gas is, to my view, a pure disaster. Very new installed combined cycle power plants have been mothballed and they stopped to produce, which will, on the long run, potentially endanger the energy security of Europe. So we need to be very careful in the kind of policy that we are implementing. The second one is about investment. I think the companies are investing a lot on new technology. Alstom, we have increased in the last 5 years by more than 50% our R&D spendings. But we cannot do that alone, because in our business, in our energy business, so you need to prove the technology. And we cannot sometimes prove the technology only with a customer because he has not the balance sheet that he used to have in the past, and he cannot afford that anymore. So we need the government also to help and to support demonstrations of new technology to make sure that it will be available and it could be cost competitive at the end. So again, I believe that a broad portfolio of technology is needed so that the companies like Alstom will really develop technologies that will help to succeed in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, we need a strong support from the government. And stable.
Thank you very much for these initial statements. Now, there, to my eye or ears, there are certain themes actually coming out here, and I want to actually now ask each of you a couple of questions. But I'll start with Professor Lee. You've told us that if asked, 4 out of 5 people say that main risk, or 4 out of 5 risks which people come forward with are to some extent related to climate change. That is undoubtedly true. I mean, this is also what my feeling would actually tell me. Now, I've watched recently when the latest IPCC report came out, it came and hit the newspaper headlines, and within 24 hours or 48 hours, it was off the headlines again, and it wasn't, it just wasn't there anymore. Now, I think there is, for large parts of the community, there's no doubt about the criticality and the need for action. Do you think that we could do something different in communicating the danger? I mean, the language itself is already quite drastic, which is being used in the IPCC report. So it's not like you would hide the fact that action is needed. What is your take on that? Do you have any ideas? What can the world do differently to communicate actually the risk so that it actually sinks in with people? And maybe does it need to sink in with different people than the audience we're trying to reach at this moment in time?
I want to say 2 things. The media report about IPCC release was about the so-called summary for policymakers of the Working Group 1 report. And there is an underlying report that make the summary for policymakers. Now, this summary the importance of the summary policymakers is that it is the approved documents by the representatives of the government, members of the United Nations Framework Convention. Therefore, every language there is really owned by the science community as well as the policymakers as well as the world governments. Now, in terms of the communication and outreach activities, I think I cannot think of any other documents that has that much of a powerful message than IPCC's or other comparable organizations' summary for policymakers. And if you get a chance to read summary for policymakers, I believe every word there stands on its own right. Now, second, the question is about the, not really about the science, but it is about how the world will react to this science report. I want to ask you to wait for a few more months. This is just the first part of the IPCC report, and we will have a second report about the impacts, and the third report about the third part of the report is about the mitigation, and then we'll have a synthesis report, which will be released in time for the COP next year. And policymakers need to review all these four IPCC reports to come up with a feasible and viable actions. So part of the messages or important messages of Working Group 1 needs to be also be viewed from the contribution from other working groups 2 and 3.
Thank you very much. Now, if I listen to Chet Davis and Eva de Boer, I got the impression that what Mr. de Boer was saying was the process is broken. And Chet also alluded to that we need to be very careful with how public opinion is shaped in that respect. I think it goes together with what Professor Lee also has just said. I mean, it looks to me that there is a message out there, but to a certain extent, the message might not, trigger responses in public opinion to such an extent as we might actually want. Also, I must say, if I look at some countries in Europe, the responses are there in public opinion, and we're actually getting in a different problem that the population is in a different corner than the industry and reality or the government, and we actually need to, and that's why also the process, of course, isn't working. But you were referring to the political process being broken, and let me address that to you first, Mr. de Boer. I get a feeling when we worked on these scenarios that we are dealing with a global issue, with a global problem, but there are no global solutions in my mind to this. And maybe the answer is that we could have global commitments to do something about this, but regional solutions to what can be done. Are we overstretching ourselves with global targets and global agreements which need to be signed? And is that the problem why the process is broken?
If you'd asked me the question, why didn't the IPCC report spend more time in the headlines, my answer would be because it didn't tell anybody anything they didn't already know. Everybody knows that climate change, but largely everyone knows that climate change is a serious issue. I think that generally the public accepts that given the economic, the financial crisis, politicians are not acting on the issue at the moment. But I think as economic conditions improve in the West, that people will become impatient. But to answer your question, I think yes, absolutely. You absolutely need different approaches in different countries that are a recognition of their national circumstances, both in terms of the level of ambition that they express and in terms of the technologies which they deploy, which will also have to be different because of national circumstances.
Jed, you talked about bad communication of consequences. So what did you mean with that?
Well, first of all, I have this peculiar notion of a contradiction in my head. It's the following. I share very much the view that even though the scientists have been telling us and providing the evidence, the situation, if anything, is likely to be worse and there's an urgency to act, it doesn't register particularly well amongst public opinion. And I think it's partly to do with the way the issue is framed. The mitigation framing is at its heart the following, I think, that if you mitigate anywhere, people benefit everywhere. That's not a very, if you see what I mean. If I actually make a commitment to mitigate, I think others will benefit. And that's difficult. I think also as was said, the focus on having a binding treaty makes it immensely complicated when what you want is, at a minimum, to encourage all those who want to come to the party to move. The contradiction in my mind is the following. If you genuinely start picking up the adaptation problem, and it is much more than an energy issue, or an energy and land use issue, because it necessarily involves water, but it involves more. It involves basic questions about public investment into infrastructure going forward. If you genuinely start to address adaptation, it's very different as a fundamental concept than mitigation. Adaptation is what I do in my jurisdiction to protect my people, and then you will get genuine involvement. Emotionally, the contact is important, and the quicker we move to trying to understand what the real consequences for me locally are, in the broad sense, of 4 and 5 degrees centigrade increase scenario, the more we're likely to get people to understand that mitigation may be a much easier option with less domestic impact in my region. So those connections, I think, are important. And those who argued, I think, early on, it's all about mitigation or nothing else, I think are fundamentally wrong. I think fundamentally, it's about the consequences of the increase and understanding the full-face impact on environments, sustainable livelihood and possibility, and the quicker we move from just energy scenarios and move into nexus scenarios, which are regionally based, the more we can begin to define the relevant regional and local jurisdictional policies that we need to implement and take the risks more intelligently.
Yeah. Now, gentlemen, I ask now all of you, why are we not talking more about adaptation? I'll tell you a personal story. I was talking to the minister back home where I come from, to the Minister of Economics, and I said we need to think about a plan B. What happens if 2 degrees doesn't happen? And he said, yeah, let's do that, but make sure that nobody knows about it. So anybody on the podium, why are politicians not talking about adaptation and plan B?
I think, Carl, if it's similar to what Philippe said about the quarterly results. There's also 4-year cycles or 5-year cycles for elections. And I would agree with Jet that the issue of adaptation is certainly, within the African context, crucially important for us as a company. So some real cases of violent snowstorms that suddenly impact your infrastructure and you lose that, or massive floods that suddenly also impacts the infrastructure. So as a business, you start looking at real issues around risk and resilience, and how do you as a company become resilient to the impacts of climate change. And I think as soon as some of those realities would start striking, would politicians start picking up this specific issue as to how to deal with this. And then I think we'll see solutions being built on a regional level, certainly on a country level, and countries actually leading this. And that is a role of business, that between society, at a local level, and business, these things should be driven and solutions should be found. And I think more so, societies will start in asking politicians and business to put those solutions on the table. But we go through these cycles of election, and sometimes it's not popular to talk about those things.
Yeah, I don't like the logical thought of that we actually have longer cycles of election, and that might also not be that productive. Something else which was mentioned, it was mentioned that uncertainty around this issue puts serious money at risk. Serious money at risk. And I'm now asking the business leaders, but everybody, what are your strategies to actually, as a company or as a government, not make the wrong bet and have stranded investments? There are some estimates about how many billions are stranded due to wind farms offshore which have not even a cable connecting it to somewhere. So what do you think we can do to make the optimum use of the financial resources we have, because they are not in plentiful at this moment in time? What as a company do you do to actually take care of that risk, that financial risk of investment? Anybody?
Well, I mean, I used to be full-time involved in the climate change process. Now I spend about 95% of my time working with companies on sustainability, not on climate. And I think there's something that we can learn from the broader sustainability agenda, in the sense that if I see companies engaging on sustainability, it's for 1, 2, or 3 reasons. It's either because they see sustainability as an opportunity to grow their business by putting new products and services into the market, or they see sustainability as an opportunity to reduce costs by using less energy, less water, producing less waste, managing their supply chain better, or they recognize that sustainability is actually essential to their license to operate, to the value of their brand. And I think we could incorporate, be well advised to incorporate some of that broader sustainability thinking into how we address climate change.
Okay, so what you say is that sustainability, and we just say that, but you actually make a very strong point on that. Sustainability becomes actually a risk mitigation strategy rather than a cost factor. And I have to do things because I have to write a sustainability report. But in your view, if we talk about these type of critical uncertainties and risks, sustainability actually becomes a portfolio insurance methodology.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, for us, and it's quite interesting as to how utilities would deal with this, because it's mostly utilities that are affected through either stranded investments. And if you adopt that quite early, understand what's going to happen, you can actually pick some of these up as some very interesting new business opportunities from that perspective. Because on the customer side, it's going to happen, and so it forces the utilities to rethink their model. And at the same time, adapt the adaptation issues, which again is it's an absolute risk management mitigation strategy that you have. So it provides great opportunities for companies, and particularly utilities.
Professor Lee, you talked about the price of carbon. Is there a right price of carbon, and how would you set the price of carbon? What, out of your experience, out of your significant experience, if I look at your background, if you had a wish free, how would you set the price of carbon in order to have an optimum impact on the issue?
I can report the status, the knowledge according to the literatures at this time, and that in general, the literature supports the idea that at this time, the global carbon tax may not be an appropriate way to approach this problem. And at the same time, many literature suggests that the bottom-up carbon pricing in individual regional markets ultimately will prove to be very effective. That's the current state of our knowledge. And I believe the investors or the other policymakers may be interested in the messages of those literatures.
Yeah. Does anybody believe that you will see a system where price of carbon is going to start off somewhere regionally, that countries say, we start having a price of carbon, and that grows slowly into a patchwork and a network of prices of carbon, because we just simply can't, agree up front on a global one?
I believe that's what you fellows assumed in the jazz scenario.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see if you actually agree to that, because I don't know if that's a true mechanism which could actually be, happening in reality. Because people could be very worried about leakage, carbon leakage, and jobs going into places where that price of carbon doesn't exist.
Carbon price to perform a very effective role in this climate change response as a climate change response strategies. Uncertainty on the future level of carbon has to be handled, And many literature indicate that unfortunately the carbon prices, performance of carbon prices or carbon credit prices in the EU ETS has not been very satisfactory due to these large fluctuations of the credit prices. And one of the role of any price is to set is to perform as a signal for long-term investment. And at this time, many speakers mentioned this morning and this afternoon that the world community need a framework that uncertainty has to be minimized as much as possible. And I believe in that category, any perceived notion of carbon price in the future will also follow that. Will always follow that wish and instructions.
Yeah. Any other views on that? I mean, this links also into, of course, a discussion around CCS. You know, yeah.
Well, I think we're already seeing different trading mechanisms beginning to emerge in different parts of the world. We've got one in Europe that's not doing terribly well. We had the floor price in Australia. In China, 7 provinces are now experimenting with emissions trading. New Zealand is thinking about it, and a number of countries are thinking about linking those schemes. But of course, an effective price is essential to that, and in fact, to broader action on climate change. I mean, humanity's been around for a long time, and we don't have a single global financial currency, so why shouldn't we have different carbon currencies operating at the same time? But as with currency conversion, judging them according to the value of the underlying effort.
Okay. Now, let me ask you something else. I think it was Brian who started talking about the social changes which are happening also when you start connecting people to the grid. You're changing their life, basically. That brings me to the topic of human behavior and the role of the human in this, and specifically, I think, the role of future generations in all of this. I got 3 children in their 20s. None of them has a driving license. They just don't want to drive. They're very urban. They just say, I don't need that. Are we underestimating maybe the way the younger people will change behavior, or are we dramatizing something where suddenly through behavioral changes and societal change going forward, you know, some of these critical uncertainties will turn out to be very different? What's your view on the role of the human being and its behavior in this context, which is very difficult to assess and normally is not very strongly represented in our future projections, because we always tend to talk about technologies and penetration rates and cost and all this. So what role do humans and human behavior play in your view? Jed?
Well, there is quite a history of examining consumer behavior and attitudes. You can go back to the early work in the 1970s on the Vow's work at Stanford Research Institute. There, what we would call sustainable consumers, they then called it voluntary simplicity, was around 6 to 7% of the population. Not that substantial. There's quite a lot of work that's been done since, and a lot of that work is to do with assessing, as a marketer, the interest and helping to design more sustainable products. And in fact, part of the sustainability agenda that Yves Debout referred to also includes sustainable consumption. How fundamental that value shift will be as we move to 2050 is quite unclear, but it's clearly something you can model in the present, and you can take some views on the future. In reality, the economic shifts are so radical, it may not be a choice about sustainable consumption. There will be parts of the world where people possibly will be living in a way that's poorer. One of the debates going on in Europe, this current generation may well find it's the first generation in several generations that will be living less well than its parents. So these economic shifts are probably as important in shaping attitudes as let's say, higher value views. And you could take a poll here. How many believe that sustainable consumption values will be the dominating value in the next generation?
I certainly believe that, so I'll put my hand up. Let me tell a story. We recently, in South Africa, we run an expo for young scientists among school children. And then we affect about 10,000 young people. And we bring them together in one place, and we look at the top 800 projects. And these are thousands of young people in South Africa across rural and urban areas. And they have to solve specific scientific problems and come up with innovation, prove it, do the research, and actually present that. And the majority of them were focusing on how do they find sustainable solutions going forward. Whether it's energy, whether it's water use, land use, the majority of young people is driven by that. And also there's quite an interesting nexus between information technology and energy use. Okay, so what has happened in many parts of the world is young people has changed governments due to use of technology. We're going to find this nexus between information technology. See what is happening in Korea today. Look at the solution in the expo down here. And look at how technology comes together with efficient energy use. And I do believe that the roles of utilities and companies, whether it's technology companies, will be driven by society, and particularly be driven by young people's demand for sustainable living going forward.
Thank you. Philip, you talked about short-termism due to quarterly results within business. Eva de Boer talked about short-termism due to election cycles. So it looks to me that we seem to have short-termism on all sides. Now, in business, what do you think needs to happen in terms of policy instruments or frameworks that companies are able to break out of this short-term driven world? Because as you have said, they're willing to invest, and they are investing a lot of money every year in order to have a going concern as a company and continue. So what would help business in terms of regulations, guidelines, policy frameworks to break that short-termism?
If I look at technology specifically, what I believe is that every business person try to minimize the risk for his company. And in this case, so there are two solutions. Either you give him a framework, long-term framework, and he can bet on, which is at the moment not the case. And it's more and more less the case, in fact. Or you can also help him to develop this strategy by sometimes helping to start new technology and prove the concept of those technologies and help the plant owner and the product providers to take the risk. It will never be a zero risk issue, but at least it will minimize the risk for them. So I think it's always a matter of risk and opportunities. And I do believe that if at the political level there are a real consistent help to invest in new technologies, not really on the way to develop technologies, but the way to prove technologies, that would tremendously help the businesses and our customers.
Thank you. Any other opinions to that point, Eva?
I want to go back to a little bit to the adaptation question. I think the problem with the impacts of climate change is that they are most severely felt by the people least able to cope with them, namely the poorest of the world. And I think as we begin to experience the impacts of climate change, and probably the North not reaching out much to help, we will see a clamoring from the South to begin to address this issue. There is a global commitment to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. You've shown through your own scenarios how improbable that commitment is, but it's out there. I do actually believe that there will be an increasing desire on the part of the political leadership to begin to put a process in place towards that ultimate objective through long-term goals that send a very clear business signal to the business community, hopefully to drive change in non-linear ways. In 1896, there was a big conference of urban planners in London, and the major headline outcome of that conference was that the #1 headline issue of the 20th century was going to be horse manure. Because as more and more people became more and more wealthy, they would all want to buy horses and carriages, and we would have the streets this deep in the results. And then along came the internal combustion engine. So a lot of our most important changes as humanity has been through non-linear exercises. And part, I think, of the responsibility of politics is to set a long-term political perspective which hopefully will free the spirit of enterprise and drive innovation in a completely different direction.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached a point in time in this session where we are going to take questions from the audience. I assume that there are some microphones in the room. So who wants to ask a question? Please identify yourself, stand up, state your affiliation, and please pose your question to one of the panelists. Volunteers. Here is somebody on the outside.
Excellent session. So let me ask you a quick question to all of you. Thinking about scenarios, when do you think is the sooner and later date, year, that we will reach energy for all? The sooner and the later year for energy for all.
Well, maybe since I know the scenarios the best, which we just presented, I can give you a first answer on that. According to our views, actually we're making good progress, most probably in the next decades on this. So I would say, to just, if I round up some of the numbers, energy access for all, so everybody in the developing world, including also the projected growth rate of the global population, which is significant, we see actually happening around 2060. And it could be as late as 2070, 2075, depending on some of the other factors. So with 2050, we're not that far off. I have to say that in some aspects, 2050 cuts off developments which are happening, and only a couple of years later, you're actually reaching there. The same is actually true for some of the carbon reduction targets in Symphony, which also, you get there, not in 2050, but you get there in up to 2070, you're already there with your target. So but this is very difficult to predict. It assumes that with the economic progress you make when connecting people to energy, the fertility rate also changes. This is behind this. And we have different fertility rates and population sizes in symphony and jazz. So in the world where people are more wealthy, they have lower fertility. That's why we have a lower population growth. Now, we have assumed that some of these behaviors are pretty stable so far. We'll see how that develops in future, but so far societies have behaved like that. Access to energy happens, you get economic growth, people get more wealthy, and as of certain levels, then fertility rates also start to drop. Some other answers here, yeah, please. And please take the microphone close. All right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, the dates are there. It's a scary thought. More than half of the world's population without energy access sits in sub-Saharan Africa. Scary thought to think somebody born today will be older than what I am, and get access to energy for the first time. And we have to accelerate that work. It is something that all of us must deal with. It is not just about how you solve the climate issues, because the planetary boundary work is fundamental in terms of the use, the natural resource use of land, of water, of forestry, and we have to bring access for energy for everybody on this globe. As important as we deal with the climate change issues, and as important as we make sure there's energy security in our countries. And to deal with that, we have to deal with affordability. So the research and development and the learning curves must come down. And as a developing world, we've always been clear that that technology transfer should happen to the developed world. The adaptation work and improvement in how we respond to that should happen together with the funding to enable that.
Professor Lee.
The question is about the timing of getting the energy for all. And I think the important factor in approaching that question is how do we get to that point? And in that regards, I want to highlight to you this jazz scenario and symphony scenario. And if you read it carefully, it gives the result that as to the energy equity, jazz scenario has a better performance than a symphony scenario. Now, I think that result is quite striking because jazz scenario is more or less a consumer-based market approach, and symphony scenario is more a top-down and voter-based decision-making process. And energy equity, the problems related to energy equity is more or less related to this free market, so-called free market consumer-based decision-making process. Now, this top-down approach produces, according to this scenario analysis, not so much better result than a jazz scenario. It seems to be quite striking and needs some explanation.
Well, one of the reasons, and I can explain that, is that the amount of money which is there to go around is, of course, not unlimited. Now, if you spend a lot of this money on public transport systems, things like that, we assumed that you have less money to spend on things like healthcare, schooling, and these sort of things. So these are very careful balances, which we also see in reality. Governments have limited resources at their disposal. And they need to be, if they spend billions in having to upgrade networks and providing storage and this, they miss those billions somewhere else. Even in very affluent countries, that can cause stresses. I mean, we are talking about the beginnings of energy, I won't call it poverty, but it's because it's a bad expression, on energy, on pressures on consumer prices in Germany. And that's a very, very rich country. And a couple of €100 a year already is putting pressure on families at the bottom of the pyramid. So this was the logic which went into why in symphony you have that behavior. It was an interpretation of how a system could develop. Jed, on the topic of...
Yeah, on the access issue, it's worth getting our heads around the sorts of money involved and the benefits. The benefits are not always taken adequately into account in analysis. We could probably achieve universal access, and there are experts out there, by 2030 at costs of around about 3 to 4% of the current global investment level in energy. Should we choose to do that? I leave rather open. There's no doubt that it is feasible, and it's probably technically feasible. Secondly, it's not just about an image of poor people and the human value benefit. We're talking here of bringing people much more rapidly into the productive economy. And that really should be well quantified, because that's partly the case. Secondly, we're talking also, which may be an important element going forward, of reducing in some areas the rates of urbanization. It's because if people cannot get a livelihood in the rural area, they will move to the urban area and be part of, as it were, some of the emerging problems. It may be much more intelligent to invest in sustainable livelihoods in places which could be genuinely sustainable. So we need, in fact, it's right and it's pleasing that you've assumed access and you've quantified access issue in the scenarios, but it's genuinely deserving of its own work at a country level or regional level, and taking into account the broader issues of the potential productive benefits. And those productive benefits are not just to the people themselves, they're to everybody, in particular those who just talk about handouts and aid. I think people don't want that. People want productive, sustainable livelihoods, and I think we should try and frame the problem in those terms.
Yep.
I'm not a palm reader, so I don't know when everyone will have access to energy. But what I do sense is that there is an interesting change in the debate around cost, the cost of energy, in the sense that I think we used to focus quite narrowly on the cost or the price of energy. You now see an increasing debate around the level of fossil fuel subsidies versus the level of subsidies for renewable sources of energy. And I think that that is taking us, or hopefully taking us, into a more holistic discussion of cost in the sense of what is the broader cost to society if we fail to act on an issue like climate change.
Okay, I want to take another question here. Gentleman here.
Yeah, my name is Khalid Benamou from Morocco, and I have a question relevant to the words you're using. If you relate them to the challenges ahead, you did mention the manure and disruptive changes that have completely changed the picture, and basically the use of words such as mitigation or adaptation. Don't you think that they could be misleading? They're not strong enough in front of the challenge that we're facing?
Well, it's a difficult one because these are the words which we normally use to talk about this. I was actually sitting here when we phrased the question on how do we communicate, and I thought to myself, well, maybe we should just write, we will die or something like that if that and that doesn't happen. On the other hand, I remember Al Gore, and he had very strong messages and images and all this, some of them not all scientifically correct, but it was a communication, event, and he used other words to do that, and yet, it triggered a whole new thinking. So, question: are these the wrong words?
Everybody uses the word, so I won't say it's wrong. For us as a company, if we don't deal with adaptation, and for us that's quite clear around business continuity, so another big word, we're going to go out of business. There's just not enough water, so we have to find technological solutions to make sure if we generate energy, we do that with zero or very little water. So it's an absolute reality for us. We go out of business. We will not be able to supply our community with what they need. So it's an absolute reality for us about staying in business and being able to respond through disaster management. We have built in our company processes for resilience. So it is things such as disaster management responses, because we are seeing the impacts, and therefore we have to adapt our business in order to deal with that.
So the clock is ticking here. I take one more question and then we are wrapping up. Gentleman here. I'm sorry. You can catch me afterwards or us. But yeah, this gentleman. No, it was the gentleman in the front row. Sorry, he was ahead of you a fraction of a second. Or you ask a question and then he takes a question and we take both of them together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Arturo Vaca. I come from a mining and metallurgical company in Mexico. Two quick questions. One, Mr. Lee, the Mexican government is right now proposing a tax on burning fossil fuels. I think it's something equivalent to $5 per ton of CO2 being emitted. I don't know if it's going to be approved or not, but a few minutes ago you said that maybe it's not the most appropriate way to do it. I would like some comment on this. And the second question is very quick, is I think there is a huge opportunity to reduce emissions by promoting better style of life. I mean, the consumption patterns of the Western societies and the developing countries are aspiring to live like the Europeans or Americans do. But I think there are ways to be as happy consuming less energy. Who is tackling this problem? Who is thinking in promoting a different way, a different style of life?
Okay.
Please.
If you then pass it on to the front row, and then the last question here. Yeah, please. And then we'll take that together.
Kande Keller, I just hope that your scenario of universal access in 60 years is not true. Like Brian Dame, I'm getting worried too. But is political risk not the biggest thing that worries companies? I was told that in Australia, 5 years ago, the election was decided on the droughts. And suddenly everybody moved to have a carbon tax and look at incentives for renewables. This last election, apparently a month ago, it was the reverse. They had droughts, but energy prices were going up. And suddenly there was a reverse. There seems to be a trend towards a reversal. Is political risk not the thing keeping investments back? The inability of the politicians, Mr. DeBoer, to give that long-term signal. Isn't that part of the headache also national? My last comment is, in foreign ministries, what I see in some of the major countries now, you have a group of people supporting energy access, efficiency, and so on, but then you have this small group of negotiators who have been in this process 20 years, who like their languages, mitigation and adaptation, and they're telling governments, don't even support access to energy because they're talking too much about sustainable energy. Do you also see that divide in a foreign ministry between the negotiators, maybe 5, 6 of them, who have been in the process 20 years, but those who are really pushing for transformation?
Thank you. Okay, let's answer these questions and then go into the closing. So I think I'll take the lifestyle question. I think what you are saying is that promotion of a lifestyle which is basically based on a lower energy footprint. This is exactly what I meant with maybe we're underestimating the younger generation. Also, we might be underestimating what technology can do. I think technology will enable us to have the same comfort with a lower footprint of energy, and I think we just can't predict it yet, and that's why we also can't have it in scenarios. That would be my answer to the lifestyle question. On the political risk, anybody want to take that? Yeah.
Well, I think the lifestyle point is interesting. I wonder what you would say to the 1 billion people who do not have access to modern energy sources and the 1 billion people who live on less than $1 today in terms of changing their lifestyles. That's a struggle. They want to get up before they go down. But on the political point, yes, absolutely, political risk is perhaps the biggest risk which we face, which is why I, as somebody who has gained all his bald spot and all his gray hair from the climate change negotiations, still think that they have value to add because they can provide that at least some long-term predictability over and beyond elections.
So, in order to close, I want to ask now, starting with Philip, to each of you in 1 or 2 sentences saying, what is the most important thing you think you heard and you want to, you take away?
I don't know if it's the most important thing I heard, but at least this is what I believe in. So I really believe that technology will change the game, and there are still opportunities for that, and to improve the scenarios, and then we need support to push it through.
Yes, I think building exactly on that point, I do not believe it's about scaring people into a solution. I think it's about encouraging people into a solution, to show them that they have opportunities to change their lifestyles, to live well, to work towards prosperity.
I know there is a talk about the Plan B for the preparing for the 4-degree warming, and I think it's not really a choice between 2 degrees, between 2-degree warming and 4-degree warming because it is entirely different state of the world, and it's not a matter of choice.
For me, I think it's the urgency of developing you can call it a coalition of the willing that are prepared to move us beyond the current pledges. In parallel with that, I would support the need to seriously begin to understand the implications of missing it so that we can begin to understand the size and nature of the risks long term.
From my perspective, I think a lot of uncertainty, but a great lot of opportunities that we face. I think driven by society and changes in society, and they're going to demand the use of technology that really starts seeing us live more sustainable lives going forward. And then the takeaway around adaptation, that is something that we need to seriously start working on, hopefully make it a lot more real in order to see some action being taken by countries.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, let me summarize what I took away as the top 3. And I think number 1 on my list is actually the access for all. I think I agree. We should do this much faster than what scenarios currently tell us, because I think it's achievable. This is something we can do. From all the dimensions of this field, this is the one which we most probably can do at not even such high cost. And I got a feeling that if we solve the access for all, we'll also mitigate already some of the upcoming climate problems. The second thing is, I think the non-linearity of technology and what technology solutions could do, as well as human behaviors, is something which I take away from this discussion. And the third one is, there is some issue with communication on almost all fronts between stakeholders. We talk about the same things, and yet effective communication, which leads to action, seems very difficult to come about between businesses, political leaders, between nations, between negotiators. So for me, these are the 3 areas which I say are obviously, if we can find solutions to some of them, we will have a more sustainable energy system going forward. It's 18:30. I promised a lot of you that we will close at 18:30. I thank you very much for your attention, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.